Aloha mai kako, and welcome to this session of Brown Bag Biography, the longest running seminar series at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. Today's talk is number 776. The series started in the mid-1980s and was the idea of George Simpson, the emeritus director of the center at the time the center was established. It is currently very ably organized and advertised by Paige Rasmussen, who is the managing editor of Biography and Interdisciplinary Quarterly and also the manager of the Center for Biographical Research, and Zoe Sprout, our current graduate assistant, who is responsible for the posters, the advertising, the tech, and everything else. So a great deal of thanks to both of them. Before I introduce our speaker today, I just want to mention a couple of upcoming events and some other things that we're involved with at the Center for Biographical Research. First is that same time, same place next week, Danielle Said, who's an assistant professor in the English department here at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa, will be speaking on the subject Cho TV, Racial Celebrity and Asian American Femininity in Prime Time. Extremely timely topic, and focusing on Margaret Cho, but taking it in a variety of directions in terms of representation of Asian Americans. We also, if you would like to know more, because we do 15 or 16 of these sessions every semester, there are still more to come. Aiko Yamashiro is going to be talking at the end of the month. And if you'd like to find out more information about our upcoming events, you can do that by joining the Center for Biographical Research mailing list. Zoe will put that link up in the chat. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for updates. The other thing I wanted to mention was the center's involvement as the publisher of the recent third volume in the series, The Value of Hawaii. Value of Hawaii 3, Hulihia, The Turning, has just recently come out in October. It's a collection of 65 or 70 essays in which people are addressing the catastrophe and the upheaval of the last year and suggesting what that might promise or offer for the future. They're short essays. The book is available from University of Hawaii Press for $24.95 if you want the paper version, but because we're hoping it's going to be used for education and also for starting up all sorts of conversations, the book is also available for free through University of Hawaii Press and Scholaspace as a download. And Zoe will put the link up there for that as well, because we want to make sure that everybody can have access to that material, particularly in schools, and there's no impediment to that. In conjunction with that, the Hawaii Council for the Humanities and a large number of co-sponsors are actually staging a number of public discussions related to individual essays as starting points for those discussions. This is a series called Try Think. It'll be going for the next 5 or 6 months, every couple of weeks, and it's entirely set up for conversation and not even necessarily focused on reading the individual essays, but actually using them as starting points for larger discussions. Zoe is putting that up as well. The next one is going to be Wednesday, April 14th at 6 p.m. And what happens here, the topics are Ancient as Modern, Transforming Public Education for Hawaiians. The second one is Activist Genealogy, Visions and Enactments of Solidarity Across Black and Kanaka Maoli Movements. And the third one is If People Aren't Locking Rocks Together, We Ain't Got a Story, Pohaku by Pohaku, Connecting Stories of Community Building. These are all tied to individual essays in The Value of Hawaii Hulihia, but they're the starting points for general community discussion. So we would urge you to follow up on that as well too. The final thing I will mention that we'll also put up in the chat is that there is an annual prize offered for the finest work done by graduate students at the University of Hawaii in the general field of life writing. This is the biography prize. There is a cash prize and also a slot in the following year's Brown Bag Biography Seminar Series. That will go up there as well. The deadline for nominations is in just about another week. I think that covers everything. In terms of the procedure here, After our speaker has given her presentation, we will open it up for questions and comments. Because of issues of security and various other things. We will be asking you to provide those questions and comments in the chat, and then I will relay them to the speaker, or she will just read them herself and respond. If you would like to speak directly and participate in that way, that's perfectly fine. Zoe will unmute and allow you to do that. But because we are recording this, you should be aware that in fact your identity will be available to anybody who sees it subsequently. Okay. Okay. It gives me great pleasure today in this session, which is co-sponsored by Hamilton Library, the Departments of Sociology, Political Science, History, Ethnic Studies, and Anthropology, the Asian Studies Program, and the International Cultural Studies Certificate Program. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Nandita Sharma, who will be speaking on nationalism and the transformation of land into sovereign territory. Nandita Sharma is an activist scholar whose research is shaped by the social movements she is active in, including No Borders movements and those struggling for the planetary commons. She is the author of Home Economics, Nationalism and the Making of Migrant Workers in Canada, University of Toronto Press, 2006, my alma mater, and Home Rule, National Sovereignty and the Separation of Natives and Migrants, Duke University Press, 2020, a recent publication. She is a professor in the sociology department here at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. I'll just add another couple of comments here. Anybody who's been around this university for any length of time is aware of Nandita Sharma's presence on campus because she's engaged in so many different kinds of activist initiatives, but also strongly invested in the educational mission and the research mission of the university. She has been extremely prominent in the International Cultural Studies Certificate Program, mentoring and encouraging really now generations of students who are doing strong interdisciplinary theoretical research. I've also always been very, very impressed by Nandita's capacity for thinking globally and yet being really, really rigorous and specific in the research that she does into particular cases and instances. She works at the macro and the micro and moves seamlessly between the two. Another one of the characteristics of her interdisciplinary interests and also her general commitment to cultural studies as a way of bringing those things together. So we've been looking forward to this for some time, and we're really glad we have such a good turnout. And I therefore would ask you to join me in welcoming Nandita Sharma.
Thank you so much for that really lovely introduction. I hope I can live up to that. And I didn't know you went to the University of Toronto.
Yep.
I got my PhD from there as well. So.
I only got my BA there, but it was wonderful.
I love Toronto and I miss it. So, okay, let me get started since we don't have that much time. Thank you very much to the people at the Center for Biographical Research for inviting me. Thank you, Craig. And also to Zoe and Paige for all their hard work in organizing my talk, and to all of the other people whose labor has made this possible, and to each of you for attending. Thank you very much. So in my book, Home Rule, I examine the emergence of what I call the post-colonial New World Order, in which people are defined as part of separated nations and ruled through the apparatus of nation-state sovereignty, international bodies, and global capital. Established after the end of World War II, post-colonialism marks the end of the political legitimacy of imperial state sovereignty and the beginning of the hegemony of national forms of state sovereignty. After World War II, with astonishing speed, the near global space of imperialism was mostly nationalized. Between 1945 and 1960 alone, 36 new nation states in Asia and Africa were granted either a restricted autonomy or outright independence from empires. In the 1960s, the two most powerful imperial states entering World War II, the British and the French, lost much of their empires and nationalized the sovereignty of their metropoles. For those colonized people who did not get their national sovereignty, the demand for it nevertheless defines their struggles. For many people identifying as Armenians and Kurds, Mohawks and Hawaiians, Palestinians and Kashmiris, their struggles are seen as one of national liberation. In the post-colonial New World Order, being a member of a nation in possession of territorialized sovereignty is the thing to be or to become. It is an aspiration, moreover, that cannot be named as such. To be convincing, nationhood must be seen not as an invention, but as an inheritance. By definition, nations are not an inheritance shared by all. As Benedict Anderson long ago pointed out, societies organized as nations always imagine themselves as limited communities. Because no nation encompasses all the world's people, nor does it want to, immigration and citizenship controls become crucial technologies for nation making and nation maintaining strategies. Etienne Balibar argues that by limiting entry to national territory and limiting rights within it, these controls produce the effect of unity by virtue of which the people will appear in everyone's eyes as a people, that is, as the basis and origin of political power. The post-colonial New World Order of nationally sovereign states thus ushers in a new governmentality, one in which people are produced as a people of a nation, and one in which land is turned into the territories in control of national sovereigns. Territorialization is a key technology of post-colonial governmentality. Territoriality, as Robert Sack usefully defines it, is a strategy for influence or controls. Territories are never simply the physical lands the state controls. Territories are those lands that states successfully abstract as state space, as sovereign territory. National forms of territorialization transform land, water, and air into the territory of a national sovereign, and in the process forge a naturalized link between a limited group of people and a certain place. As each nation imagines that it has its own place on earth, nationals come to see themselves as the people of a place. The ground upon which national homelands are built is post-colonial racism. The historical articulation between ideas of race and nation, wherein ideas of national soil are racialized and racist ideas of blood are territorialized, result in the formation of neo-racist practices wherein each nation, seen as comprised of a distinct type of people, exists within a supposedly horizontal system of separate and sovereign nation states. Those excluded from ideas of national belonging in the actual places they actually live come to be represented as foreign bodies contaminating the national body politic. They are made into the people out of place. In this way, hostility to those who move or who are imagined to have moved is bred in the bone of the post-colonial New World Order. In a world of nation states, national sovereigns have the right to determine who their members are. By law, only nationals have the right to enter the territory of a nation state. Rights within national territory are formally guaranteed only for citizens. We see the exercise of these rights to determine and limit membership across the world. Every nation state certainly participates in the endeavor to carve up the planet into so many national territories. So do political projects who currently struggle for national sovereignty. In home rule, I discuss this in relationship, for instance, to the membership battles taking place within the Mohawk and Cherokee nations. Such activities produce the figure of the migrant. In the post-colonial New World Order of national sovereigns, migrants are made the quintessential other. Migrants are those people whose mobility into nation states is regulated and restricted. Classifying a person as a migrant ensures that they are legally denied the rights of national citizenship rights where they live. Through the seemingly banal operation of citizenship and immigration controls, the post-colonial New World Order not only produces, but also normalizes a racism in which political separations and segregations are seen as the natural spatial order of nationally sovereign states. In the dogma of nationalism, the believer's sacred duty is to enforce the national borders separating citizens from migrants. Nation states thus mark territorial as well as affective borders. In so doing, they demand that we choose sides. The enactment of immigration controls historically distinguished nation states from other forms of state power. Imperial states, for example, were largely intent on bringing as many people into imperial territory as possible. This is captured in the Roman Empire's maxim of imperium sine fine, an empire without end or limit. Limitlessness through the expansion of imperial territory and the numbers of imperial subjects was a key part of imperial projects. Barbarians, people at the edges of imperial state power, were declared uncivilized, i.e. non-state people, and as such, threatening. Empires thus strived to bring these people and the places that they lived into empire. The more people whose lives imperial states controlled, to labor, to pay taxes, to soldier, the more power imperial rulers had. For this reason, James Scott refers to the earliest states in the Near East, formed about 5,000 years ago, as quote unquote population machines. Like all states, imperial states also controlled people's mobility. It is not for nothing that an origin of state is stasis or immobility. However, imperial states were primarily concerned with preventing people's escape from imperial territory. Simultaneously, imperial states also moved people into imperial state spaces across numerous continents and archipelagos, largely to labor or to fight for its glory. Indeed, empires developed entire systems of movement, including Atlantic slavery, convict transportation, and the quote-unquote coolie system of indentured labor. Imperial state practices concerning the entry of people into its territories thus operated under what Radhika Mongia calls a logic of facilitation. Nation states reversed this imperial order by operating under what Mongia calls a logic of constraint. Put into place after the abolition of slavery in the early 19th century as the British imperial state sought new ways to secure and discipline a now ostensibly free labor force of so-called coolie labor from its colony of British India. By that century's end, by the end of the 19th century, immigration controls defined the sovereignty of emergent nation states. The first immigration restrictions were put in place in the Americas. Indeed, the nationalization of state sovereignty was announced and institutionalized by controls limiting both the entry and the rights of those who came to be classified as migrants. The nationalization of state sovereignty profoundly reshaped the imperial imagination of the political community, the space and makeup of society, and importantly, the relationship between the state and those subjected to its rule. Nationalist discourses promising, quite falsely of course, a horizontal and cross-class sameness among nationals normalized their rule by institutionalizing stark differences between nationals and migrants. This communitarian basis of nationalized sovereignties produced a shift from imperial to post-colonial racist strategies. The nationalist process of sorting which people were and were not the people of a place dramatically bifurcated people's freedom of mobility. Nation states largely eliminated imperial exit controls, but increasingly regulated and restricted the entry of people. Nationals not only had the exclusive right to enter the nation state, but they were the only ones with the right to stay. Migrants, in contrast, came to be defined by their deportability. Consequently, migrants were defined as outsiders to national society and its culture. That is, they were made people out of place. Importantly, not all people moving across national borders were regarded as migrants. Not only do we have a world where some people are not considered migrants, but are instead called expats or backpackers, adventurers, and so on, we also do not see the movements of people seen as belonging to one or another nation, but who reside outside of its claimed territories as migrants either. National borders are not only, National borders were not only limits or barriers, but also conduits for the realization of post-colonial power. Immigration controls created an environment of life, one that normalized the fragmentation of a global capitalist labor market into national labor markets. Within each nation state, citizen workers were seen as having a right to jobs, at least a right to the good jobs. But within every nation state were also migrant workers who came to constitute a distinct labor market category by virtue of being defined as a people out of place. One's wages, types of work, membership in labor unions, formal workplace protections and rights, as well as access to state benefits and services depended on whether one had citizenship status or not. Citizenship and immigration controls thus not only produced national natives and migrants and gross inequalities across the world, they also produced highly competitive capitalist labor markets. In so doing, they fundamentally strengthened employers and states' ability to exploit and control workers. A world capitalist system in which nation states rule gave capital greater leverage. By the 1960s, the universalization of the nation state system occurred alongside the start of neoliberalism. With the addition of new nation states, the number of competing sites for capital investment grew. Each new nation state came with the enactment of new national immigration controls. Citizenship and immigration controls intensified competition between workers, within as well as across nation states. The result has been greater disparities of all sorts. Perhaps the greatest of which is the infinitely greater mobility rights granted by nation states to capital investments than to migrants. Far from being a contradiction, this is instead an integral feature of the governmentality of the post-colonial New World Order. As new nations and new nation states form and older ones dissolve, the unity needed to keep a nation intact is continually challenged. New national liberation movements arise to set new borders and different limits to national belonging. People demand that they be reunited with their fellow nationals, but not fellow citizens resident in another nation state's territory. People may demand more rights for locals over non-locals in gaining access to property, services, or votes, even when those non-locals are co-citizens. Or they may demand that the nation state tighten up its immigration controls to better serve and protect the nation. Redefining which people are a part of which nation and which nation should control which territory secures the body politic as national. Arguably, with every reimagining of the community as national, a hardening of nationalism takes place, one that further restricts membership in the national political community. Increasingly, the discourse of autochthony is deployed to do this work. What is autochthony? Derived from the Greek autos, or self, and katon, or earth, an autochthon was one, originally in the plural, who had literally, quote unquote, sprung from the earth. The term referred to an original or indigenous inhabitant of a place. The term indigenous is also from classical Greece. To be indigenous was to be born inside, with the class connotation of being born inside the house, inside the master's house. Like autochthon, indigenous denoted someone or something, trees, animals, etc., born or produced naturally in a land or region, native to or belonging naturally to the soil, the region, etc. Because this framework is a relational one, the other to the autochthonous or indigenous were the allochthons, predicated on the Greek allo, referring to that which is other or different, and the Indo-European allo, referring to something or someone else, and first used as a geological reference about rocks. Allochthonous referred to something from some place other than where it is currently found. It was not until the period of, it was not until actually the mid-19th century that people, and not only rocks and things, were defined as allochthons. Autochthonous discourses restrict national belonging to those who can show that they are native to the nation. In a way, such discourses define national forms of state membership with its idea of national sovereignty over territory. Thus, even though the state category of native, which initially marked the status of a colonized subject, both of my parents were born as the natives of British India. So even though the state category of native was thought to have disappeared along with empires as colonized natives became independent nationals, I argue that embedded in each idea of national sovereignty or home rule is the notion that true nationals are those who are also natives to the territory. By restricting the making of claims to sovereignty, territory, and rights to those who are national natives, discourses of autochthony produce borders that are even more fortified and difficult to cross than those of the borders between national and migrant. Placing people into separated categories of national natives and migrants is no trifling matter. People's relationship to nation states, to national political bodies, and to one another are organized by the rights associated with the category people find themselves in. As such, disparities intensify across the world system of nation states, a further contraction of the already limited criteria of national belonging has taken place around the figure of the national native. At the same time, an expansion of the term colonizer has occurred, one that encompasses all those who can be seen as migrants, as out of place. Borrowing the imperial meaning of native as colonized people, national natives see themselves as being colonized by migrants. In turn, migrants' own experience of colonization is seen as unimportant and unpolitical. Instead, migrants are demonized as destroyers of national native space. The separation of people into categories of natives and migrants has and continues to animate some of the most deadliest conflicts in our world. Even before mass killings began in June 2012, the separation of people into natives and migrants in Burma, also known as Myanmar, has been the ideological basis for what human rights observers believe is the world's most recent genocide. Not only was Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi silent about this when she headed the government there until a couple of months ago, the international community, led by the United States and China, has largely ignored it. Eager to normalize relationships with Burma and gain access to the estimated tens of billions of dollars worth of verified natural gas deposits found in the Bay of Bengal, close to where the targeted and supposedly migrant Rohingya people primarily reside, little mention is made of how Myanmar has stripped Rohingya people of their citizenship, supported the burning, looting, and killing of Rohingya people and their homes, placed them in what a growing number of people classify as concentration camps, and forced hundreds of thousands of people to flee Burma, all in the name of protecting the indigenous rights of Burmese Buddhists in Myanmar. In the Darfur region of Sudan, a populist Save Darfur movement has successfully reframed the economic, ecological, and political legacies of European imperialism into a conflict between indigenous Africans and migrant Arabs. This has played directly into the hands of oil companies and further fueled the Islamophobic US-led war on terror. In Rwanda in 1994, of course, those acting in the name of the native Hutus killed approximately 800,000 migrant Tutsis. The most potent and inflammatory label during the Rwandan genocide, and the one that was most often used to describe Tutsis, was that of colonizer. A not dissimilar process took place in the 1991 to 2002 Yugoslav Wars. Ideas of native belonging fueled the claims to Serbian, Croatian, and Bosnian homelands. Those people targeted for ethnic cleansing were defined as foreign elements who were out of place in other people's homelands. 140,000 people were killed and another 2 million people displaced in the process. The ideological basis for the forced expulsion of Asians from Uganda in 1972 was the indigenization of Black Uganda. Claims to native rights to rule nation states led to military coups d'etats aimed at unseating elected Asian parliamentary leaders in Fiji from the 1980s to the 2000s. And such a politics continues to shape violent xenophobic attacks on migrants in South Africa. Xenophobia also informs white supremacist moral panics over immigrant invasions across Europe and the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And as was made painfully clear with the 2016 election of Donald Trump in the United States as well. The politics of separating natives from migrants can also be seen in an increasingly popular discourse in the nation states of the former British white settler colonies, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, where the white in white settler colonialism has been dropped amid a growing chorus of opinion which asserts that all people who are non-native, including those who are racialized as Black, Asian, or Latinx, are settler colonists because they are migrants. Indigenous activist Sakej Ward has even said that, quote, the label settler is too historically and politically sterile, and that they are nothing less than occupiers. In these reformulations, migrants are held responsible for the colonization of natives, the stretching of the category of settler colonist to include those who were expressly excluded from white settler colonial projects is part of a politics centering indigenous sovereignty over territory. Yet, even though most people who make such claims evoke land, it is territories which are being claimed through the discourse of indigenous sovereignty. Nationalisms within native nations define battles over who does and who does not belong. We can see this in the May 22nd, 1981 adoption of the Ganawake Mohawk Law and Moratorium on Mixed Marriages, or the Marry Out, Get Out Law, and in the efforts by the Cherokee Nation to expel Cherokee freedmen, descendants of Black people held as slaves by Cherokees and brought with them on the Trail of Tears to the territories later defined as Cherokee National Territory. Overturned by courts in Canada and the United States, these efforts at limiting national membership demonstrate not only the racialized basis for ideas of the nation, but also the continuous process of culling who is and who is not a member of the nation. In all of these nationalist conflicts, Native women's bodies are symbolic producers of national territory, and migrant women's bodies are symbolic pollutants. No one is spared. Combatants on all sides target women for either being native to the enemy or for being the enemy because she is a migrant. Significantly, in each instance of the aforementioned national politics of autochthony, migration is conflated with colonization. In them, real or imagined human migration today, hundreds or even thousands of years ago, is seen as nothing less than colonization. Being or being seen to be a migrant is synonymous with being defined as a settler/colonist to someone else's claimed national territory. And colonialism in the process becomes nothing more than the existence of migrants in the nation. This is what makes autochthonous politics so uncanny. The conflation of migration with colonialism results from what I argue is a structural aspect of the post-colonial New World Order. In it, being a migrant is seen as having no lawful claim to land, and definitely not to territory. No claims to livelihoods, no claims to political membership. Yet being a migrant is not only a state or juridical category, but also a social one. Consequently, anyone placed outside the limits of the nation can be made a migrant, as we can see with the Rohingya in Burma. Across the world, there is a strong tendency to move people from the political category of citizen to that of migrant. In this sense, the national politics of autochthony is marked by nativism. Indeed, it is not a coincidence that nativism, the idea that some influence originating from abroad threatens the life of the nation from within, arose alongside the influence of nationalism in the mid-19th century. Nativism became an important political force when states, starting in the Americas, began the process of nationalizing their sovereignty in the mid to late 19th century. Today, turning migrants into colonizers is part of the politics of nativism, informed by calls to make the nation great again. This was not only central to the agenda of President Trump, but defines the anti-immigrant politics of both right and left across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The migrant is the figure who, national natives believe, prevents the nation from realizing its full glory, a glory that many nationalists worry has become a thing of the past. At the same time, of course, each instance of autochthonous politics is specific to its historical and social context and is voiced by people very differently affected by imperialism, racism, and nationalism. White national natives within the nation states in Europe or in the former white settler colonies, indigenous national natives, for example, those people who have been classified as Indians within these later nation states, and national natives in national liberation states in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, each mobilize a discourse of autochthony to make claims to national sovereignty. Yet, however much they share in common, and they do share a lot in common, they're not equivalent. White people demanding the expulsion of migrants in the name of being the indigenous people of Europe, for example, are not equivalent to various Indigenous claims to national sovereignty in the United States, Canada, or Australia. Nor is it my argument that all contemporary discourses of autochthony advocate or mobilize genocidal violence against migrants. Indeed, discourses of autochthony deployed by some Indigenous national natives, for instance, argue that national sovereignty is essential to take good care of the planet, to take good care of each other and the generation of life to come. At the same time, however, there are important similarities in the different uses of autochthonous discourses, and these are not merely semantic. All autochthonous discourses portray nativeness as an essential, unpolitical characteristic of some people and as the primary basis for political power. However, nativeness is neither an essence nor an analytic tool. It is instead a racialized idea and a political category, allowing some to make claims, whereas others cannot. All autochthonous discourses are relational. They produce migrants as the negative others of national natives. By articulating nativeness with nationness, and claiming that it is only national natives who have legitimate claims to political power, autochthonous discourses count on the subordination of migrants. This is the case in far-right autochthonous politics, and it is in the case of metaphysical indigeneity in sovereign futures of quote-unquote decolonial love. Each type of autochthonous discourse establishes national nativeness as the necessary basis for political action, sets racialized limits to belonging and rights, and valorizes nationally sovereign territory. In doing so, each mobilizes particular philosophical, material, and relational ways of knowing and being that normalize the post-colonial New World Order with its national forms of political, social, economic, and affective power. By so doing, the enormous disparities and violence of post-colonialism is further entrenched. Hence, I argue that the deployment of autochthonous discourses reveals a crucial feature of post-colonial power. All nationalisms are fundamentally autochthonous and productive of a hierarchical separation between national natives, or the autochtons, and migrants, or the alloctons. Across the political spectrum, from far right to hard left, the right of national natives is the right to home rule. In the process, migrants are left without a home in this world. The separation of natives and migrants is, I argue, both a legacy of imperialism and constitutive of the hegemony of nation-state power in the post-colonial New World Order. Indeed, the idea that national natives are colonized by migrants is one aspect of the confusion of what exactly post-colonialism is. One of the most commonly expressed complaints and misunderstandings about post-colonialism is that the post in post-colonialism fails to acknowledge that some people are still colonized, be it politically, economically, and/or socially. What this usually means is that some people, having organized themselves into a nation, lack sovereignty over claimed territories. This confusion, however, only confirms post-colonialism's hegemony. Embedded in the idea that the post in post-colonialism is meaningless is the idea that the end of colonialism occurs when all nations have obtained their national sovereignty. This is a confusion of decolonization for post-colonialism. The two could not be further apart. Post-colonialism, far from ending the violent practices and relationships of colonialism, marked the ascendancy of the national form of state power and its reliance on nationalist subjectivities, national forms of exclusion, and the kind of violence that nation states carry out. Postcolonialism is, therefore, a form of ruling that substitutes demands for decolonization with demands for national sovereignty. Postcolonialism has indeed ended the legitimacy of imperial states, but not the practices associated with them. Instead, practices of expropriation and exploitation have expanded and intensified in the post-colonial New World Order. Far from freeing people then, national liberation has freed up capital instead. This is not a coincidence, nor is it simply a byproduct of something called neo-colonialism, with its web of financial dependencies and military occupations across nationally sovereign states. Instead, like imperialism, the rule of nation states is part of a global regime of power. However much each nation state insists on its separation from others, and it insists very heavily on that, each nation state operates within an international and interstatal regime of ruling. Instead of living up to the rhetoric of national liberation, the post-World War II extension of national self-determination to colonized people extended the reach of both capital and states into people's lands and their lives. Under pressure to develop, the expropriation of land and the exploitation of labor became crucial elements in the glorification of national liberation states, like the one that I was born in, India. The rubric of modernization drove and depoliticized these states' emphases on capitalist markets by derogatorily portraying societies without fully developed markets in land, goods, services, and labor, and without people who didn't have a fully developed sense of either nationalism or possessive individualism as somehow backwards. More national liberation states grafted the discourse of national development onto local class, racist, and religious hierarchies within the nation state. Mega development projects, the destruction of the rural economy, and the resultant urbanization, along with import substitution policies, valorizing industrialization, expanded the ranks and immiserated the proletariat. As more and more land was expropriated by both states and by capital, as more and more of the remaining commons was tilled and titled as either public or private property, as more and more aspects of people's lives came under the surveying eyes of the nation state, more and more people found that participation in capitalist markets for land, for food, for shelter, for clothing, for healthcare, and more had become even more of an imperative than it had been under imperial rule. This left most people in the national liberation states with little option but to sell their labor power in exchange for the stuff of life. Thus did the global capitalist system expand under national liberation, under post-colonialism. Unsurprisingly, a pall of what Paul Gilroy has called a post-colonial melancholia soon fell over people's dreams of decolonization. It fell first and hardest over those who had only recently been transformed from the native subjects of imperial colonies into the national citizens of independent nation states, those who had actively placed their hopes in the same national liberation states now organizing and exacerbating their impoverishment. But a post-colonial melancholy also enveloped people all across the world, including in the former metropoles that had, by the mid-1960s, also nationalized their sovereignties. Here in Europe, for example, the nation was no less of an alibi for the expansion of the power of capital and states. The melancholic character of the response to the failures of national liberation meant that in both the former colonies and in the former metropoles, it was all things foreign, foreign states, foreign corporations, and most importantly, foreign people that were held responsible for people's misery. and for people's immiseration. This too was fully in keeping with the governmentality of post-colonialism. Many people who became a people grossly misidentified their feelings of loss. Rather than question the rhetoric of nationhood or national sovereignty, people in both the former colonies and the former metropoles assumed that their nations did not have enough sovereignty. In the national liberation states, post-colonialism was renamed neocolonialism in a bid to explain why national self-determination felt like imperialism, or worse. In the nation states of the former metropoles, the recurring crises of capital were misread as resulting from the movement of people from the former colonies into now national territories. Migrants were offered as an explanation to nationals for why their nation states failed to deliver jobs and prosperity for all. Both of these deflective discourses only deepened and prolonged the melancholic response. Within the nation state and nationalism, monopolizing the political, it could not be generally acknowledged that national sovereignty was bound to fail people, both national natives and migrants. My reason for writing Home Rule is to have us take account of what was lost in the victory of national self-determination so that we can do better in our next round of struggles against expropriation and exploitation. I believe that a collective and cooperative project for decolonization is possible. One that can unite people who are currently separated by the categories of natives and migrants. I say this not in some flight of utopian fancy or because of some deep-seated denial of the very real harms that are done to people categorized as either natives or migrants, but with the knowledge that only by coming together in a shared political project can we defeat those who lord their power over us. Such knowledge has long been put into action by many people. People who have been colonized, enslaved, and or indentured together built maroon societies. People fighting against slavery asked, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Pirates freeing themselves from the sovereign power of ships' captains sang, "All for one and one for all." Diggers addressed each other as fellow creatures. Women accused of speaking out of turn declared that, quote, God was no respecter of persons. And many direct producers organized against capitalism under the banner of Workers of the World Unite. Each of these struggles to break the chains of servitude to states and to capital was built on the mobile politics of solidarity. People's shared experience of the terror of expropriation, exploitation, and oppression led to people's shared resistance and to shared subjectivities. Tragically, the struggles that I've outlined just now were all lost. The victors cemented their power by institutionalizing private property, expanding the capitalist mode of production, enhancing states' power, and weaving an interlocking web of ranked hierarchies normalized by ideas of race, nation, and gender. Their greatest victory was the fact that many people experiencing expropriation, exploitation, and oppression saw themselves through these ruling identifications instead of acting in solidarity with other direct producers. In rejecting the post-colonial New World Order with its separated political categories of nationals and migrants, or natives and migrants, I embrace a collective struggle for our common and borderless planet. A version of the land-back struggles that sees everything within our biosphere as related and connected, the contemporary struggle for the planetary commons is our latest effort to decolonize our world and our imaginations. another effort to make our heaven on earth, despite the jealousies and violence of those who only want to be sovereign. Thank you very much. Thanks for all the claps. That looks very nice. Yeah, the Zoom thing is so illuminating.
And thank you very much for a presentation that I'm sure has everybody thinking in every direction almost imaginable. I would welcome in the chat any questions that people would like to put up or general comments. I'll start with, let's see, Mingbao Yu saying, thanks, Nandita, for this really lucidly and eruditely argued presentation. We also have Lei Lin saying, thanks, Nandita, for this insightful talk. We appreciate Craig Zoe and the Center for Biography for hosting. Lei from SOC Colloquium Committee. Do we have other comments or questions? We've got probably about 15 or 20 minutes to be able to entertain those. Let's see. And you've got the option of either sort of raising your hand, but here we are. Okay, this is Shupi Suneo. Thank you, Professor. This was so very inspiring. Question, how would you read home rule into the context of Hawaii?
The million-dollar question. Thank you so much for your question. So I would read it in the same way that I would read the struggle for national sovereignty by any group of people who have organized themselves as a nation and who are struggling for sovereignty over the territory that they claim as belonging to that nation. You know, I think that we see examples of that across the world. So I wouldn't distinguish Hawaii from any of those other political projects. What I should distinguish, however, is that what I am specifically referring to are those political struggles who evoke and who invoke indigeneity, sovereignty, territory in their struggles for what they imagine is decolonization, right? The association of national liberation with decolonization that I try to to show is a false association in my book. But I'm not saying that all people who are struggling for decolonization are doing so under the mantle of nationhood, sovereignty, territory. And certainly there are people who do that in Hawaii, who struggle for decolonization outside of that framework in Hawaii as well as everywhere else in the world. I hope that answered your question, but if not, please let me know.
Well, here actually is a follow-up that heads down somewhat of the same path, although elaborates somewhat. This is Bruce Kaimi Watson, who says, instead of a human-constructed nation, Aupuni is the human recognition that collective survival is necessarily an Aina-constructed understanding of communal living, aloha Aina. How can we accomplish establishing a shared philosophy in Hawaii where the philosophy of this place has been the target of epistemicide? Which I'd be very interested to hear a response to just the term. Mahalo for inspiring all kinds of thoughts and questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that epistemicide is precisely the correct term to describe and to analyze what is happening in Hawaii, as it is also equally important to understand what happened across the world. Ways of knowing and being that did not rely on capitalist markets for the stuff of life, that did not rely on sovereigns for the permission to have a life, were systematically destroyed here in Hawaii and across the world as capitalism expanded, as sovereigns claimed territory. So I absolutely agree that that's precisely the right term. In the talk, I did mention that there are Indigenous sovereignty activists and scholars who argue, for example, that we can obtain a world outside of these structures, right? Outside of the structures of capital, outside of the structures of state sovereignties, through the framework of indigeneity, for example, right? Leanne Simpson in her ideas of decolonial love, for instance, right? The issue that I have with those kinds of projects is in the definition of who the we is in the we who will be decolonized. And I think that that's where I differ from a lot of people engaged in decolonial struggles. I do think that unless we are able to see that asking the question, who are we, is already assuming that there are some people who we are not, right? And in a world that has been through blood and fire, absolutely, but a world that has been brought together, in such a world, to now pry us apart into separate national territories, however we term it, and to say that the rights to the land in those national territories belong to those who we define as part of this limited we, that actually not only mirrors the current structure of the world, so it's not at all revolutionary. It's actually the part of the status quo. It's just a new group that is engaged in the same practices, but it actually prevents decolonization and a return to, or a future of, a world that we have an epistemology that connects life and being back together again, right? I hope that was not too convoluted. I'm sorry, I'm just a little bit tired. So I hope that made sense. If not, please let me know.
Okay, the next question here is coming from Leilin. Recently, there have been some scholarly efforts to either break down the empire-nation-state dichotomy or show how they co-constitute each other, e.g. nation-empire, empire of nations, imperial nationalism. How does the post-colonial tradition engage with and or move beyond that recent trend? Thanks, Nandita.
Thanks, Leigh. That's a very important and interesting question. Absolutely, right? The current nation-state system is a legacy of colonialism, right? It's a legacy of imperialism. It's, and again, that's one of the arguments that I make in the book, that those who want to imagine that national liberation or national sovereignty is somehow outside or against imperialism fail to recognize that nation states are actually, and national sovereignty are legacies of imperialism. So definitely I would see that they co-constitute one another in that way. But I would make a very strong argument to say that nation states are not imperial states. I actually think that the way we use the concept of imperialism to describe certain processes of expropriation, exploitation, occupation, war, etc., are not helpful. And they're not helpful because, let me just give you an example. When the United States occupied Iraq, right? We could hearken back to a century, or actually less than a century earlier, when the British Empire took over what is now called Iraq, the area that Iraq now occupies, right? Actually, it is more than a century ago. When the British Empire occupied, expropriated land, privatized property, exploited the labor, they made that territory part of the British Empire, and they made the people who were living in that territory British subjects. When the US occupied Iraq in 2003, did not become part of American territory. The people living there did not become American citizens. And so we need to understand national forms of expropriation, exploitation, occupation, and not just kind of harken back to previous models that don't do much in helping us to understand those processes. So I would also, as I discussed in my talk, imperial states had a very different relationship to mobility controls over people than do nation states. And if we collapse the two and talk about nation states as just another form of imperialism, we kind of actually miss the major forms of social inequality and how they are produced in the world today.
Okay, this is coming from Victor Gregor Limon. Aloha, Professor Sharma. What would you think are the consequences of considering migrants as settlers that are complicit in the settler colonial project? Is this merely a harsh but strategically necessary step toward nation-based liberation of indigenous peoples, or is the exclusion of migrants actually detrimental to national liberation movements?
Yeah, so the way that I would frame that is that the exclusion of migrants is absolutely central to the national liberation movement, right? And that's precisely why we see the expansion of the term settler or colonizer to people who obviously were not part of the colonizing project and are not part of the colonizing project. So Mahmoud Mamdani recently came out with a new book in which he makes a very useful distinction between settlers and migrants, which might be useful for us. He defines settlers as people who come somewhere, who go, who are somewhere with the absolute intent to destroy what exists there and to replace it with a new epistemic, a new ontological, a new material order, right? Whereas immigrants, the way Mamdani distinguishes immigrants from settlers, is that immigrants come to an already existing polity, an already existing epistemic, ontological, material, political, social structure, and try and live there, right? So I would say that the contemporary move to call migrants, for example, here in Hawaii, primarily Asian, the move to call people in Hawaii Asian settler colonists is central to the project of Hawaiian national sovereignty. Whether that is going to produce anything that is deserving of the name liberation is another question altogether, right? So in my book and in general, I would make a very, very strong distinction between decolonization and national liberation. People have won national liberation all over the world. It has not led to their decolonization. And there's no reason to expect that to occur in any of the existing places in the world where people are struggling for their national sovereignty and don't have it yet, and are in the process of making a very stark distinction between themselves and migrants.
Okay. I just want to tell everybody our usual policy is that no shame at leaving at 1:15, because in the world before COVID, this meant that people got to class on time. But we will, if it's okay with Nandita, continue on at least to address the last couple of questions here. But please feel free to go, no shame. This is coming from Jake Atienza. In 2016, the Netherlands stopped using the terms allochtoon and autochtoon to differentiate those with and without a migration background. I am curious if the Netherlands was part of your research, since to some extent the basis of your presentation today includes the concepts of autochthon and allochthon. What can we learn from such regulation of national identity in a country that has centered itself around progressive ideals? The use of those terms until so recently shows how it has perpetuated such separatist, colonial, and worldviews. The context, of course, is the rise of populism and right-wing ideals alongside the migration crisis of Europe.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I love your pronunciation of autochthon and allochthon, Craig. It's much better than mine. I've got to take some lessons from you. on that. So yeah, the Netherlands, I didn't study the Netherlands in great detail, but I did note that it did have an official use of these terms, allochthon and autochthon, in their own language. And actually the Netherlands had broken allochthon, right? The allochthon is the others, the people out of place, the people from someplace else. That the Netherlands had actually subdivided the allochthons to Western allochthons, right? Like people moving from the United States to the Netherlands, who are white, in their imagination at least, and those who are non-Western allochthons, right? So they were even subdividing these others even further. So we know that even though the Netherlands eliminated those kind of official designations in the law, that in the cultural and political life in the Netherlands, those still reign supreme, right? We know that anti-immigrant politics are really central to electoral politics in the Netherlands, right? And to the experience of everyday life there. So I don't think that, unfortunately, just simply getting rid of those designations, those formal designations, has really changed very much. You know, and we can see other manifestations of those in how you become a Dutch citizen, for example, right? You have to learn the Dutch language, so on and so forth, right? So there's already this idea of, if you live in this place, you must be this certain type of person, right? The type of person who speaks Dutch, for example, right? So let me just see if I've answered all of your question here. Yeah, so, you know, I would say that instead of there being a migration crisis in Europe, right, there's actually a crisis of nationalism in Europe, right? That the crisis is the inability for people to organize their social, economic, cultural, political life in ways that we can actually coexist, right? In ways that we can actually undo the hierarchies that, again, were initiated by imperial states, but altered and intensified by nation states. So I do think that there never has been a migration crisis in Europe, right? That Europe is the crisis. So I would just like to reframe our crisis talk a little bit.
Okay, and we'll go to Mingbao Yu as the last sort of comment here. And question. Nandita, I really appreciated your mentioning of post-colonial melancholia, which I think is crucial in understanding the claim towards national self-determination, because it references the past objecthood of colonized, or for that matter, any subjugated people. I couldn't agree more with your concluding comments, but how can we actually transform this post-colonial mentality into the vision you have proposed? Question mark?
Yeah. That's of course always the most important question: how to bring about justice, right, in this terrible world that we have all inherited. Yeah, post-colonial melancholia, I found, you know, Paul Gilroy's book with the same title to be enormously helpful in trying to understand why national liberation, even though all of its failures are evident for us to see, and we, you know, people who live in places that gained their quote unquote national freedom, independence, home rule, etc., why there's an inability to actually name what the source of the problem is, right? And instead to actually argue for more of the same, right? That the problem is that we don't have enough national sovereignty. We're not liberated. We're not nationally liberated enough, right? We need more of the same. And how they see, like I recently noticed a post on my social media celebrating Nkrumah from Ghana, right? The first president of Ghana, who penned the book, who penned the book Neocolonialism. He was the first to coin that term, who penned his book called Neocolonialism at the same time as he was expropriating land from people in Ghana to create hydroelectric dams that were then used to generate electricity for the Kaiser Aluminum Corporation, right? And pocketing some of the proceeds from those deals, right? That at the same time that Nkrumah is penning a book on on neocolonialism as the problem in Ghana and elsewhere, he's actually contributing to the immiseration and just plain misery of the people who are living there, right? So post-colonial melancholia, just even as a concept, is very useful, right? The way to undo melancholia is through grief, right? This is a kind of Freudian framework. But, you know, Freud was definitely wrong on a lot of things, but I do agree with his analysis on the importance of grieving instead of being stuck in a melancholic place, right? So grieving is acknowledging that what we had is gone, right? It's not coming back. How do we move on? How do we build a world together? You know, how do we deal with the conditions that we find ourselves in and try and make a world that we will be once again happy in, right? And I think that, so this post-colonial melancholia was a very useful concept. So I think that that's what I would say. How do we get there is we need to actually define what the problem is. The problem is not a lack of national sovereignty, right? The problem is a globally operative capital that is expanding as we speak, as well as a system of nation states that delude us into believing that the national is actually a community that somehow transcends class, right? That the richest of us and the poorest of us are all part of the same community, and therefore we're never going to deal with class. I think we have to acknowledge what the problem is and then devise ways, new political movements that are capable of winning what it is that we need. And again, I would argue that what we need is a commons, right? Where, you know, the basis of the commons is the right to not be excluded, right? Which is very different than citizenship rights. The right for every being on this planet to not be excluded, to an expansion of who we are, right? I think that those are kind of necessary steps before we can even think about a new way of being with one another.
Yeah, and I would just point out there, just because I happen to know many of the people who are here today, that notion of sort of global communication is actually represented here, because I know we've got people here who are currently in China, who are in Canada, who are on the East Coast of the United States, and probably other places I'm not aware of. There is a final question that Jason Alexander brought in, which takes us in another direction. So I'll raise it, see if you would like to briefly respond to that, and then we'll bring things to a close. All right, thank you, Professor, for a very clear overview of home rule. I remembered seeing a social media post by a scholar who questioned a roundtable of scholars on diaspora. Why is there no discussion of a concept of global white diaspora? Does this relate to the racialized conceptions of migrant status overlapping with the nationalist origin narratives?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thank you, Jason. White diaspora. Yeah, you know, white is a relatively recent invention. Diaspora is a much older concept. I would imagine that there's probably some white supremacists out there who are arguing for a white diaspora. I actually hate the term diaspora. You know, it's just like, what does that mean? Like, diaspora seems to have in it a kind of autochthonous basis, right? Where, like, when we talk about the Indian diaspora, right? Implying that somehow we all share something because of some origin in some place called India, right? So the Jewish diaspora is, you know, usually thought of as like kind of first expression of this concept of diaspora. But the term diaspora, I think itself is not a very useful one in the way that it is normally used. The best way that I've seen it used actually is by a scholar named Avtar Bra, who recently retired. I think she taught at SOAS in London. I think so, I forget, I could be wrong. And she wrote a wonderful book called Cartographies of Diaspora. I think that's what it's called, diasporic cartographies. In any case, look it up. And in what she argued in that is that we all live in a diasporic space, right? Which means that none of us on this planet live in some kind of fantasy space of pure, purity of a single quote unquote culture, right? That all of us, not just those of us in large metropolitan centers like London, England, but all of us actually live in a diasporic space, right? That the space is diasporic. It's not people who are diasporic, right? That we, all of us live in a shared culture, really, right? Instead of these kind of ideas of racialized, nationalized cultures, it's to try and shift our understanding of what we mean by culture away from ideas of race and nation, right? So that's how I would answer your question.
And with that, I will bring the session to a close and just ask people to thank Professor Sharma for a stimulating and provocative talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming, everybody. Thank you. And thank you, Craig. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Paige.